and then in the Nubuwwat, dealing with Prophet and the prophetic attributes, which we did last week. And then finally, what we call the Sam'iyat in Arabic, with the Sama'a, things that need to be conveyed to you. In other words, the way that this tripartite division was done was according to epistemology. It's a fancy word which means based upon the sources of knowledge. So in Ilahiyat, talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we can understand things from rational inquiry as well as Sama'a, as well as conveyance. In Nubuwwat also, similar thing. However, Sam'iyat, what we call things that can only be conveyed to you from a Sama'a. So we need to have an authoritative source for us to believe in them. Because if we believe in the authoritative source, then we should believe in the actual content of that authoritative source of what they're trying to convey to us. So hence the belief in the unseen, the end of days and the apocalypse, signs of the apocalypse, or the hour of Sa'ah, as we get to, and then the ramifications of a changing world. So belief in that which has been conveyed of the unseen. So we said, the basis for this, it's conveyance by an authoritative source, as they cannot be perceived by the senses ordinarily, nor deduced by a rational. That means that it becomes obligatory for me to believe in these things if I have a truly authoritative source, in the sense that it cannot be disputed. So anything that comes from the Quran is disputable. So for example, it talks about paradise, hellfire, it talks about angels, it talks about jinn. It can be inferred also from the verses that talk about karamat al-awliya, and the mu'jizat, the miracles of the prophets, and the saintly miracles of the saints, or the awliya. So all of these things, by virtue of them being in the Quran, and them being more or less unequivocal in understanding, we have to believe in them. Then there's the hadith. The hadith also has things like this, that are very, very strong hadith. But then there are, we know there's a classification of hadith, there's hadith hasan, hadith da'if. So in those things, in matters of aqeedah or creed, we usually don't take content that we say belief in them becomes obligatory on that particular basis. So, for example, we do not have a hadith that point to some of the order of events during the Day of Judgment. In other words, it cannot be sort of understood or interpreted unequivocally whether we go to the Sirat first or the Hawd first, or there's two ahwal, there's two pools of the Prophet ﷺ, one before, one after. These are different interpretations. Something called the Sirat, or that bridge that goes over hellfire, yes, that we believe in. But in the particular order of what happens in the next life, we don't necessarily have to have a creed about something where there's not something authoritative and unequivocal. And there's going to be also a slide about that. Those matters that can only be known by a truthful and trustworthy conveyance from the Prophet are real and obligatory to affirm as real. Again, they go from the Quran, or they come from something of the hadith that's mutawatir, or at least sahih, very strong authoritative hadith. So this includes the unseen that predates the creation of man, like the angels, the jinn, the throne, the sacred tablet. These are things we cannot perceive or by senses or by rational inquiry. Nevertheless, we hold them to be real because we hold the one who told us about them to be real. So as well as the events yet to come, such as the events of the hour and the signs leading up to it. So I mentioned paradise, hellfire, the reckoning or hisab, the Antichrist or the Dajjal, and the descent of Jesus, which we can have more about that when we talk about the signs of the hour. And then things of the past, the previous nations and their prophets. The Prophet ﷺ only knew about Qawmi Musa, the people of Moses, and the people of Abraham, the people of David and Solomon, and even the creation of Adam and Eve, because he was told and revealed to him via the Quran. Otherwise, he had no other source by which to know those things. And we have no other source by which to know those things. Yes, it's in the Gospel, it's in the Psalms of David, it's in the Torah. We believe those were divinely revealed books. However, we believe they've been also manipulated over time, so we don't take stock in it as an authoritative source of revelation. Nevertheless, the Prophet ﷺ instructed us not to لا تكذبوا أهل الكتاب ولا تصدقوه. يعني don't declare the people of the book as liars, nor take everything that they say at face value. So sort of to have a kind of hands-off approach when it comes to what they say, or that came in the gospel, that came in the Torah, because much of it could be true, right? Much of it could be what remains of the originally revealed divine message, and much of it may not, and we don't know which is which. So obviously that which you can probably assume that which is in accordance with the Quran, or very closely in accordance with the Quran, you could say could be something of the remaining divine message. And many of the scholars actually, in our past, they did read the gospel, they did read the Psalms of David, they were translated into Arabic, and some of them brought up the similarities. So it's not incorrect or wrong to read them, but to realize that they are not considered to be sources of divine revelation for us right now. Then there are things we don't have to have an opinion about, but there's no particular creed about them. So matters of the reality of the universe or events of the past from the Quran and Hadith make no specific claim, nor any unequivocal interpretation, are open to conjecture and speculation. They do not require specific belief, which are many things, right? How old is the universe? I don't know. They say 13.8 billion years, but I don't have to necessarily have an opinion about that because there's no revelation that tells me a particular age. So I'm not required to have an opinion about that. How did languages develop? Ethnicities, tribes? How did we go from Adam and Eve to dark-skinned people in sub-Saharan Africa and light-skinned people in the Nordic region, and then in between, you have in between, and ethnicities and languages, how that all happened from two people. Different theories abound about that, or how that actually happened. But I don't have to have necessarily a specific creed or theology about how that happened. Many of the ulama spoke about it, and they had their theories about it, even about how language developed. Many of them, for example, said that language is tawqifi, which means it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there were original ancient languages, Arabic being one of them. And then these ancient languages, then vernaculars developed from them, much in the same way that vernacular languages developed from Latin in Europe. So you had Latin, and then the so-called Romance languages of French, Spanish, and then later on Italian, developing from these original Latin. So much in the same way, we don't have to have necessarily a particular creed about that. We don't have to insist on an opinion. The burial places of prophets might surprise people that we don't really know for sure, for certain, except one, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We know for certain that it's his place in Medina. Otherwise, places I visited the tomb of Moses in Jerusalem, or outskirts of Jerusalem. There's also in the city of Hebron, or Khalil, where Abraham and Isaac and Ishaq and Joseph, many of the prophets mentioned in the Quran, are purportedly buried there. Nabi al-Lahud in Yemen, the prophet also in what is now Oman, from the people of Ad, and so forth. So there are particular places where these prophets saw them. For example, Thamud, also in the Arabian Peninsula. And many of our scholars, for example, or the awliya, they say we have kashf, we have unveiling, we believe that they're here. Or like John in Damascus, right? So we take this to be, it's considered, right? In the sense that I can choose to believe in that, but I am not required to. If someone were to come to me and say, I don't believe Abraham is in Hebron, that doesn't sound right to me. How would we know 2,000 years later? Then? Fine. It's not going to, you're still a Muslim, doesn't make you not a Muslim or anything like that. But those who do choose to go about something that is less than completely unassailable reporting of such a thing, we can't blame them. But those who do choose to believe in that and take it in stock, and then they visit those places, on the basis that they do have the tombs of the prophets, that's also not blameworthy, that is praiseworthy. So in our epistemology, we can accommodate both. Just like when you read, for example, some of the books that talk about the karamat of the awliya, some of the saintly miracles that they did and so forth. Some people read and be like, I can't believe this. It sounds unbelievable. And I would say, fine. It's okay. You don't have to believe that specific instance. But in general, the existence of karamat, this is where I'd say, no, you have to affirm because it's mentioned in the Quran. The people of the cave weren't prophets, they were people, awliya, who slept for 309 years. And we defined karama as something that defies normally experienced phenomena. So that you cannot deny because it's in the Quran. Specific instances, you hear stories about it, you don't feel comfortable with it, that's okay in the sense that, I'm not going to blame you for it. Even though on a personal level or from amongst our teachers, for most of those things, we do take stock. So verification of prophets, the presence of alien life, this question people always get. Does the Quran say anything about aliens? Are people on Mars or not? It wouldn't change a thing if there were, right? We would still say that the Lord of the Earth is the Lord of Mars, of Pluto, of Jupiter, of Saturn, of other galaxies that we haven't found yet, or any of that type of stuff. It wouldn't change anything about our understanding of the divine, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or anything. It wouldn't shake us in terms of faith or anything like this. Some scholars have said that most likely there is not, right? Allah doesn't specifically mention it, but not mentioning something doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? And many people don't understand that concept. So lack of mentioning something doesn't mean that it's not there. The onus of proof is on the one who has to prove it is there, not that it's not there. Even things like historical things, the identity of the son who was to be sacrificed by Ibrahim alayhi salam. Many of the ulama, or most of them, you could say, said it was Ismail or Ishmael. Others said it was Ishaq. The Maliki scholars, and Malik himself, believed it was Ishaq. The majority of scholars believed it was Ismail. And then there are other scholars that said, we don't know which one. So we suspend our judgment about which one it was. We know it was a son, but we don't know which son. So even things that happened historically, we don't have to have a particular creed unless there is an unequivocal text, nas, that tells us this is where it was. And as I mentioned, the position of suspension of a particular belief or judgment is referred to as a tawaqquf by the ulama. So madhab al-tawaqquf, or the school of tawaqquf, or the position of tawaqquf. Waqf means to stop. Tawaqquf means to not have a particular, to elect not to have a particular opinion, right? Which sounds counterintuitive in the times we live in because everybody has to have an opinion about everything. But sometimes when you don't have enough information, you just say, I don't have an opinion about that. I don't have to have an opinion about how old the world is, or, if some of the hadith mentioned that Adam and Eve were up to 60 cubits in height, making them what would be by our standards giants, then how did we get to, 6 feet and 5 feet? I don't know. But I don't have to know. I don't have to have a particular belief about that. So the end of days. This usually goes along with what we talk about is sam'iyat. In other words, we talk about the actual instance of the hour, the things that will be there, as well as the signs of the hour. And the Prophet ﷺ many times was asked about mata as-sa'a. Right? Even the Quran says, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ السَّاعَةِ. Right? They ask you about the hour. In other words, when? Right? So implicit in our understanding is that there is a when. Right? There is going to be an end to all of this, where all of creation, all of life, everything that exists as we know it, will be gone, except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the whole time and space aspect and concept of what we have will all be gone, just like it was nothing from before. It will go back to the way it was. And then it will be revived, but for the next life in a completely different life, for the end. But he was asked repeatedly about the hour, and in the famous Jibreel hadith, even the angel Jibreel asked the Prophet ﷺ about the Sa'ah. And his response was, مَنْ مَسْئُولَ عَنْهَا بِأَعْلَمَ مِنَ السَّائِلِ. The one who's being asked does not know more than the asker, the questioner. For Jibreel as well doesn't know when the hour is. Nobody knows except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No one had, even the Prophet ﷺ did not know when he was going to. Did not have that knowledge. Allah did not give him that knowledge. So rather than Jibreel asked him, فَأَخْبِرْنِي عَنْ أَمَرَاتِهَا. Tell me about the signs of it. This is where the Prophet ﷺ did answer that question, which means that having a knowledge of the signs of an hour is something we should be acquainted with. We will never know when exactly, but in our state of preparedness for it, we will see signs. So the signs of the hour of the apocalypse are mentioned. There are two mentioned specifically in Jibreel hadith. We're going to go over many more that were mentioned outside of that hadith. But the two that were mentioned, and تَلِدَ الْأَمَةُ رَبَّتَهَا, that the bondmaiden will give birth to her master, and the naked, barefoot, and destitute shepherds, that they vie in building tall edifices. So there's various interpretations about what these signs actually mean. And one of the things that is allowable in our interpretation of signs is that they could be validly understood for a particular time, historical period, with a certain interpretation, and still valid with a different interpretation for a later historical period. Right? So the people of the time who lived 1,000 years ago may have understood these two hadith different ways. Right now, these two signs in different ways. So the second one we all think of, like Dubai and tall buildings and used to be nothing. And yes, makes sense. But people who lived in a prior period to that may have thought of it differently, which is also valid. It's not invalid to think of that way. So each of these ahadith can pertain in a particular way to their time. However, some of them will only really make sense in certain times, certain periods. And as we will see, there are certain signs that happened initially and they continue to happen and will intensify as we get closer to the Day of Judgment. So that's how we divide them up into major signs and minor signs. Minor signs would be those things that kind of may have even happened a long time ago and continue, but the major signs will indicate sort of an imminent, short number of days before the hour comes. And imminent could mean a number of few years, but something that's much more imminent than before. And the Prophet ﷺ, he even said about himself, I was sent, and me and the hour are like this. In other words, very close. Very close. So you can make the assumption that more time may have passed before the Prophet ﷺ in the history of man than more time is to come. Allah. So the question, why did the Prophet ﷺ tell us about the signs? What good is that for us? To make us depressed? No. Right? The idea is that it's a knowledge that's important and will also help you to practice your deen in a way that's better and more informative. For some of the reasons that I believe that I mentioned earlier. One, to increase the iman of the believers, because when you see the sign actually happens like the Prophet ﷺ told you, it is kind of an ongoing miracle, right? Much in the same way when you read the Quran, not all of us have the ability to sort of perceive the miraculous nature and the inimitability of the Quran. Right? It takes, I would say, a certain amount of language and understanding. But when certain signs are mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ and you see them clear as day before you, then this also should increase one's iman.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
The previous slide you mentioned the signs, the model, can you explain that a bit?
The bond maiden will give birth to her master. Different interpretations. Some of them said that it's an indication of sort of what they call tafashi uquq al-walidain, that the people disobeying their parents would be something very pronounced and much the norm. In other words, a woman will give birth to a daughter, or it could be, in the hadith it says rabbataha, another hadith where it says rabbiha, so it could be male or female. So actually that the son or the daughter becomes sort of the master and having dominion over the parent instead of vice versa, right? And we might think in today's times we're like, yeah, that's like everybody does that, it's no big deal. But there used to be a time when that was unheard of, right? When the Sahaba were told that do not revile your parents, they said, how was someone going to revile them? It was unheard of. Even in Jahiliyyah it was unheard of. It wasn't so much just an Islamic concept, it was kind of a universal human concept. No one acts up with their parents or reviles them or raises their voice or anything like this, right? And then that's when the Prophet ﷺ told them, well, if you revile other people's parents, they will revile yours. So they understood how that could happen. But for a direct sort of cursing of parents, no one had any concept of this. So one of the signs is the bond maiden will give birth to he or she will have dominion over her, will be the master. So the reasons, one of them we said to increase the amount of the believers, to provide warning of the hour and its close proximity. Right? The Prophet ﷺ told people to hasten to good works, to not waste time. Don't wait till you're too old or too sick or too infirm, or don't have himma, or you're dead. right? Don't, or you're busy. All of these things were mentioned. Don't wait for any of those things to happen. And some of them said, some of the ornaments say that there's Sa'a Sughra and Sa'a Kubra. So there's a minor hour and the major hour. The minor hour is when you die, because it kind of begins for you at that point. You don't have to wait for all of these signs and the blowing of the trumpet and the, you know, the dissolution of creation. Once you're dead in the grave, that is for you a Sa'a, right? That's the hour for you. So that can come at any time, right? That can come at the next instant. So the Prophet ﷺ used it to hasten people to good works and not to waste time, and to realize that really this life is trivial in terms of how much time we're actually given, but still significant in what we do with that time.
Sa'a Kubra and Sa'a Kubra and Sa'a Sughra.
To remind them of the wretchedness of the world, right, and not to vie with one another in trying to have power and dominion over it, right? Because if it's going to all end, why am I wasting my time with something that doesn't stay, right? It's like, why should I build all the big major palace and all of this money spent when it's all going to be gone one day? I'd rather build myself a palace in paradise. And that's a much different way of going about it than when you do in the dunya. So this world, you know, Allah says, right? The next life is better and longer. So why waste your time in this particular life? And so we need to be constantly reminded. One of the best type of dhikr, remembrance, is remembrance of death. Imam al-Ghazali chooses to conclude al-Ihya with remembrance of death. You know, that's how he sees the culmination of all that he talked about. At the end of the day, the reality is we are finite creatures with finite amounts of time, and we're going to die. And then once that happens, then there's nothing we can add to ourselves. Once that expires, that's it. So don't waste your time. To reconcile the perceived and real gap between the Prophet ﷺ's teachings and the contemporary reality of its claims. This one I added myself. I think that it's important for us to see that when we read about the seerah and the history of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba and the companions and many of the great ulama, and then we look around and we're like, no one is doing that. No one is really having a kind of manifestation of all of these beautiful traits and characteristics that we read about all the time. So how do we understand that? How do we reconcile that? How can we reconcile that Muslims killing Muslims all over the world today? Right? People doing things, despicable things in the name of Islam all over the world, and yet we're supposed to have the most beautiful deen. Well, the Prophet ﷺ is telling you that that's what you should expect. He foretold of all of this. Every single thing that's happening now, you can find a hadith. You can find something the Prophet ﷺ mentioned specifically of how it's going to play out and how it's happening. I'm going to get more into that. So it's important, I think, especially for contemporary Muslims to be aware of this. And I think what it's going to mean is it's going to change how you see life. It's going to change how you see Islam, in a sense, right? And I think we are going to have to learn to focus on kind of being content in terms of other people's actions with less, or expect less, right? And sort of having this very idealized concept of what things could be or where they're going to go. We should measure that with what's actually happening and what the Prophet ﷺ actually foretold of what's to happen. Now, it's not a reason to be pessimistic, but I think it's a way for us to be more attuned to what to expect and to be more realistic and not to have dashed hopes. So, and also to inform the attitude and action of Muslims when these signs appear. Right? Prophet ﷺ also spoke about when you see these signs, what should you do? What should one do? How should one react? How should one live when they do appear? And we will be talking about that as well. So these are what I call, I picked out 3 in particular, there's more, but to me these are kind of emblematic or integral in terms of what do we do, or how do we see the signs of the hour? What should our attitude be? So one of them, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, بَادِرُوا بِالْأَعْمَالِ فِتَنًا فَقَطَعَ اللَّيْلِ الْمُظْلِمِ يُصْبِحُ الرَّجُلُ مُؤْمِنًا وَيُمْسِي كَافِرًا أو يُمْسِي مُؤْمِنًا وَيُصْبِحُ كَافِرًا يَبِيعُ دِينَهُ بِعَرَضٍ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا. Strive with your deeds before tribulations as many dark nights appear. A man awakes a believer and ends his days a disbeliever. or ends his day as a believer and awakes as a disbeliever, he sells his religion for a small stake of the dunya. Next one. إذا لعن آخر هذه الأمة أولها فمن كان عنده علم فليظهره فإن كاتم العلم يومئذ ككاتم ما أنزل الله على محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. If the last of this community curses the first of it, then whosoever has knowledge, let him show it, bring it out. As the concealer of knowledge in those days is akin to the one who conceals that which Allah has revealed to Muhammad صلى الله عليه وسلم. يحمل هذا العلم من كل خلف عدول ينفون عنه تحريف الغالين وانتحال المبتلين وتأويل الجاهلين. This knowledge is carried by the just from each generation. They negate, in other words, they negate the distortions of the extremists, those who carry it, the just carriers, the fabrications of the rescinders, and the false interpretations of the ignorant. So the first one, بادروا بالأعمال, strive with your deeds. And بادروا means get an early start, don't wait. Hasten is probably the word I should have said. Hasten with your deeds. Before tribulation, there's many dark nights appear. Right? And it says, تَقْتَطَعَ اللَّيْلِ الْمُظْلِمِ. You know what it means? It means like there's a chain, there's a succession, one after the other. Right? There will come a time when they're one after the other and it seems like there's no reprieve. One after the other, one after the other. So, what should you do at that point? Strive with your good deeds nonetheless. Right? And thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you wake up a Muslim and you go to sleep a Muslim, the next day you're still a Muslim. Because it's a big deal. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying here via the Prophet ﷺ that it is a big deal. Right? And then people will consider nothing of the deen. They'll sell it for nothing. Practically nothing. If the last of this community curses the first of it, which happens. In other words, people living now will say, oh, those people back then are those Sahaba. And there are people who curse Allah and curse the Sahaba and curse even the Prophet ﷺ, right? Hashana, and ridicule and mock and so forth. This is what's happening now, and there's a distortion of what was actually happening, who those people were. So when this is about, then whoever has knowledge, let him show it, let him bring it forth. Do not conceal it, right? And here knowledge doesn't mean book knowledge or riwayah. It means true knowledge of what those people actually were on, and you can manifest that. So it's not a time to conceal it, it's a time to bring it out. Yeah. آخر هذه الأمة, this ummah. Right? The first of the ummah, not necessarily the Prophet ﷺ, but the people around the Prophet ﷺ. And remember, even non-believers are part of the ummah of Muhammad ﷺ. Then the last one, this knowledge is carried by the just from each generation. Notice how he refers to ilm. يَحْمَلُ هَذَا الْعِلْمِ مِنْ كُلِّ خَلَفٍ. That means it's carried from one generation to the next. And one of the things that we've been trying to express over and over is this idea of chain of transmission or isnad. That this is a transmitted tradition from one generation to the next. And that means, my understanding is, if they're not part of that transmitted tradition, then they're going to be part of the three groups that they have to negate. Namely, those who distort, the distortions of the extremists. It's all over the place. I don't have to even talk about that because it's all over. And none of those people have Senate, none of those people have teachers, none of those people have any type of real link to the Prophet. Only in their tongue. The fabrications of the rescinders, intihal al-mubtilin, right? People who even completely fabricate something about Islam, right? Why? Because they want to make iftar. They want Islam not to be there anymore. They want it to go away. And then ta'wil al-jahilin, and then the false interpretations of the ignorant. So that means without khalaf, without udul, khalaf means one generation to the next, without just people in this generation, then expect this to happen. And that's exactly what's happening. So signs of the apocalypse, or the hour, three major types. There's other divisions we can talk about, but for our purposes. Signs that have already occurred and stopped, in other words, they've kind of happened already. Minor signs that have occurred and continue to intensify. And then major signs indicating imminence of the hour, that it's coming very soon. signs that have already occurred. The birth of the Prophet ﷺ and his death is the most major sign that has occurred. He said, I was set and me an hour like this, indicating that it's a sign of the hour. And another hadith, he mentioned specifically that his death ﷺ is one of the signs of the hour. Sayyidina Anas ibn Malik, after they had buried the Prophet ﷺ, he said, we had not finished burying the Prophet ﷺ, we dusted our hands, we no longer knew ourselves. Even the Sahaba were changed forever. They were never the same after that. So the greatest musibah, the greatest calamity ever to befall us was the death of Muhammad ﷺ. All this other stuff that's happening, very small compared to that. The death of Umar ibn Khattab, the second Khalifa. In the hadith that's narrated by Bukhari, where Sayyidina Hudayfa, who was given some knowledge of the hypocrites and some of the knowledge of the ghaib from the Prophet ﷺ, Umar was asking him about it. And he asked specifically about the tribulation fitan, kamawj al-bahr, the types of tribulations that are like the waves of the ocean. In other words, constant and successive and growing in intensity. And then Umar asked him, is this door going to be open or is it going to break? Yuftah am yuksar? He said, la yuksar. It will break. Right? And at the end of the hadith, the tabi'i who's narrating, he said, and we knew this bab, this door to be Umar. Radiallahu anhu. So with the death of Umar, it actually was the beginning of the fitna even between the Sahaba. The great tribulations that started to happen in the time of Uthman, as we know, and then extending into the time of Ali, everything was changed after this bab, this door was broken, and Sayyidina Umar was assassinated by a Persian Muslim. So that also was mentioned specifically as a sign of the death of Uthman ibn Affan also. The conquest of Jerusalem. Fath Bayt al-Maqdis, Prophet ﷺ mentioned this specific hadith. The security of the Arabian Peninsula, so that there will come a time when people can go from Sana'a to the other end of the peninsula and they don't have to worry about anything. And there was a time that wasn't like that. Even though that time may have expired, there was such a time. The disruption of Hajj. People don't know that Hajj actually was disrupted for a number of years during the Mongol invasions. There was no Hajj, nobody went. Mass death, such as in plagues, where people die where they're sitting on the spot and in droves. This happened during many plagues. And the overrunning of Baghdad by the Mongols also mentioned. There are other hadith mentioned as well. But this is just a selection. Minor signs that have occurred and continue to intensify. The hour will not come until the most successful people will be luqa' the luqa'. And this is an Arabic reference to the unintelligent or the devious. In other words, the most successful people, the most well-known, the happiest, will be the most devious or the most stupid and unintelligent. No comment. There will come a time...
I don't know, you look that way, look this way.
When the forbearing believer with his deen will be akin to the one holding on to a hot coal. The hour will not come until people vie with one another in the mosques. Hadith. Hadith. Prophet ﷺ said it. Another hadith, he said, the hour will not come until voices are raised in the mosque.
It's minor.
Or amongst the signs of the hour, corruption, obscenity, severing of familiar relations, false accusation of the trustworthy, and the trusting of the traitor. Much rain, but little cultivation. Many readers, it says qurra, Wallah Azim, the hadith says qurra. Many readers, many people who read, but few learned ones. And many leaders, umara, kathrat al-umara, many leaders, but few trustworthy ones. وَقِلَّةِ الْأُمَنَاءِ. Few of them are trustworthy. Even though there's many of them. People who read all the time. But none of them have knowledge.
It says the most successful people, they talk about success in the worldly sense.
Yeah. أسعد الناس is the hadith. It says أسعد الناس. So I translate successful. You could translate happiest, but I think the meaning of the hadith means in terms of how they are perceived by people. How they perceive, yes. So perceived because they're not going to be أسعد الناس in the day of judgment, but in terms of their perception. So it means, if you look at some of these hadith, the whole criteria, right, of what we would call the thawabit, what we would call sort of the supposed to be unassailable, unchanging kind of pillars of the way humanity works, will all be challenged and will all slowly, diminish and no longer be there, right? And so you can think of it as this diminishing of the internal meanings of the way the world should actually work is, it's going to precede the diminishing of the physical aspects. And some of the physical aspects are mentioned too. Kathrat al-zalazil, right? Many earthquakes. Like here, much rain but little cultivation, right? So we live in a time of kathra, of a lot of accumulation, but so little meaning to it. People have so much, but yet at the same time they feel like they have so little. So, and even the ummah was described in this way, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, يُشَكَ أَنْ تَدَعَلَكُمْ كَمَا تَدَعَ الْقَصَعَ إِلَى أَكْلَتِهَا أَمِنْ قِلَّةٍ نَحْنُ يَوْمئِذٍ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ لَا بَلْ أَنْتُمْ كَثِيرٌ وَلَكِنْ كَغُثَاءِ السَّيْلِ وَكَمَا قَالَ صلى الله عليه وسلم. He said there will be a time when the nations, the communities will come upon you like the prey upon the predator upon its prey. And they will say, is it because we're so few in number? Sahaba couldn't understand that. How's that possible? Right? Because even when we were few in number, we were still victorious. Allah gave us victory. He's like, no, you're not few in number. But rather you're like the froth from the wave when it hits the beachhead and then it comes back. You know that fizziness that's left over? Nothing. You dissipate. You don't have any meaning. You don't have any power. You don't have any tawfiq. Success from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So your numbers will not mean anything. It's not about your numbers, but it's about the meanings that you carry.
Can you give me an example, like a believer holding on to his deen, like hot coal, like, what does it mean? Like,
It means that...
I mean, I heard him give analogies and stuff, but like, does that mean like people being forced, forced not to practice their religion and they're holding on to any part of it they can, or?
Could mean that,
yeah.
But I think for the way I look at it is that when you're living in a community or society that is righteous, that is pious, it's much easier for you to be that way too, right? When we go on these small trips and we make umrah or we go to communities where we feel that way, we find we're better people. Well, what if that everybody around you is not like that, and you're actually struggling just to hold on to your own practice of the deen because you feel like you're by yourself, right? That's what I think it's like, holding on to a hot coal. It's a struggle every day just to do it because you have no awan, right? And even the Prophet ﷺ, he talked about us. He talks about his ikhwan, right, his brothers. And the Sahaba said, Alasna ikhwanak ya Rasulullah? And we're not your brothers. He said, no, antum ashabi. But my ikhwan are those who come after me and who believe in me, even having not seen me, and they have no a'wan, they have no one to help them like you have me to help. I have a few more of these. There's 100 of them. The liar is believed while the truthful, while the truthful are disbelieved. The mihrabs are adorned while the hearts are ruined. Walazim. تزخرف المحارب وتخرب القلوب. So very nice, ornate masjid, everything there, but in here, men suffice themselves with men and women suffice themselves with women. From the signs. The proliferation of police. Nothing against you, Jerry. Tired NYPD. No, it actually says Kathrat al-Shurat. Kathrat al-Shurat. And Shurat from Shurta, which means anyone who's kind of helping the government police the country. Spreaders of false and idle news and children born out of wedlock. Also mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ. It becomes more, this is hadith, it becomes more beloved for a man to raise a puppy than raise a child. Notice the theme in all of them. Things that used to be taken for granted, things that used to be kind of fabric of society, all of that crumbling. So the way I read these hadith, they all have the same central theme. Things that the internal meanings are beginning to crumble, are beginning to dissipate, and as a result, even the earth begins to crumble and dissipate. Wallah Azim, I don't think this whole global warming and the melting of the glaciers and all of these earthquakes and all of the so-called natural disasters, or a tsunami that wipes out 200,000 people. The earth is complaining, right? The earth is complaining about what's happening, what we're doing on the earth. And because of our own deeds, our own actions, the earth acts out. right? And we know that there will come a day when the earth will speak, right? إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْضُ زِلْزَالَهَا وَأَخْرَجَتِ الْأَرْضُ أَثْقَالَهَا. What does that mean? And the earth will take out that which was weighing heavy upon itself. It's not talking about the molten core in the center of the earth. It's talking about all of these deeds, all of these acts, vices that have been perpetuated on the face of the earth on itself. So the earth complains, right? If we personify the earth, remember in Arabic he thought that everything was personified, that they actually had some type of spirit even though we couldn't perceive it. So the trees, the earth, the ground, the rocks, they gave salam to the Prophet ﷺ, right? So why would they not complain when the opposite is happening? And how does the earth complain? It shakes. How does the skies complain?
Thunders.
Thunders and lightning and tsunamis and disasters.
It's gonna happen. Yes. Also, there was one, if I'm not mistaken, one recording in regards to the earth becoming a woman in one of the last days or whatever, and being questioned about the things that it had inside of it that it used for the destruction of men. Can you elaborate on that? So Allah will make the world or the earth become a woman on the day of judgment? No, you didn't hear?
Ard is mu'annath, it's feminine in Arabic language.
Okay.
So the language, إِذَا زُلْزِلَتِ الْأَرْضُ زِلْزَالَهَا.
Okay.
Right? The hat goes back to the earth, but Ard is in the feminine.
Okay. So would it be questioned about what it had produced already?
It will tell by itself. Just like our own body parts will bear witness.
Okay.
Right? Allah will give personification to our own body parts, to our tongues, to our hands, to our feet, to our private areas. They will speak and say, we can't lie that day. Everything that was done will come out. Except to whom Allah shows mercy and decides to conceal them. Right? And the hadith that says a person who conceals for his brother will be concealed on the day of judgment. Completely opposite of the way people live now. Everyone wants to bring out everybody's shortcomings, everybody wants to have evidence to make a scandalous claim and so forth. But if you conceal your brother,
Allah will
right,
conceal you.
Allah will conceal you. That's the paradigm we want to come back to. So, that's all after. Major signs. So the major signs indicate imminence of the hour, which is the end of creation, it's the time as we know it, and when all will be destroyed except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after which a second blow of the trumpet by the angel of Israfil will dignify the resurrection, or Qiyamah, which means resurrection, where all souls will receive their just due, not known, and know their final abode. Imam al-Dardir, he mentions 5 major ones in history. Some mention 10, some mention less, but these are kind of the 5 in this particular order as well. So the appearance of the Dajjal, the descent of Jesus ﷺ, the appearance of Juj and Majuj, the appearance of the beast or the Dabba, and then the rising of the sun from the west. So the first one, the appearance of the Dajjal, it's said that he'll be on the earth for 40 days, but not a regular 40 days. Because the first day will be like a year, and then the second day will be like a month, and then the third day will be like a week, and the rest will be like the regular days. So we're talking about a year plus, a year and maybe a year and a half. But in that, he will enter every single place on the earth except Mecca and Medina, which he will not be allowed to enter. And he will have hordes of followers, because he will be doing some things that will seem miraculous. He will make the earth rain. He will make plants grow. He will heal people seemingly. He will cut people in half and put them back together. The ulama differ about those things. Are they actually real? Does he actually do that? Or is it type of sorcery of the eyes? Some of them said that it's not real, but it's made appear as such. Others said, including Imam Nawawi, said no, it actually is real, but the believers will know that even though those particular things are real, that he is an impostor. Because there will be other signs to show that he is an impostor. People will clearly read on his forehead, kafir. He'll be awam, right? He'll be, only one, see out of one eye, the other eye will kind of be like malformed, amongst other things. So people will be able to recognize that, that he is not indeed who he claims to be. But nevertheless, many will follow. And that will include people from all faiths, not just Muslims, Jews. Many of the hadith mention Jews in particular, but it doesn't mean that only they're going to follow them. It will include other people as well. One hadith that one of my teachers told me is that from amongst the people who follow the Dajjal will be people who wear a type of head covering that comes down like this, kind of like what they were in the Arabian Peninsula. The Lutheran and all that, that type of thing. 40,000 of those people followed the Dajjal.
Shaykh, is he supposed to be a human being, but do you have
Yeah,
parents?
he's a human
Do
being.
you have parents? Brother.
Nothing specific about whose parents were, but yeah. Yes. And he also corruption on the earth. He's called the Masih al-Dajjal, the Messiah, or from the word Masah in Arabic, because he was able to enter all these places in such a short amount of time. And no one will be able to stop him, except the next sign, the descent of Jesus alayhi salam. Yes?
So during the time of the Sea of Dajjal, is there a date that says that one day in existence will be like several years? Meaning that his existence will be.
Yeah, it'll feel like that. There's also difference opinion what that means. Will it be just a perception? Will the actual days be shorter or longer? Again, that it could be interpreted in both ways. So the descent of Jesus, alayhi salam, as we know, our belief in Isa alayhi salam or Jesus is that he actually never died. He was never died, so he has to be resurrected. So the Quran clearly states, وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. He was not killed, nor was he crucified. وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. It was made to appear as such. وَلَكِنْ رَفَعَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْهِ. And then Allah raised him in a manner that is becoming to Isa alayhi salam. We know that Prophet ﷺ actually was the last living human being to meet him in the night of the Ascension, the Isra and Ma'raj, and even describing what he looked like. He said that he looked like Urwa ibn Mas'ud al-Thaqafi, who was one of the Sahaba from Ta'if, or Bani Thaqif. And we know when the Prophet ﷺ was in Ta'if, the reaction that he had. Some years after that, Urwa ibn Mas'ud went to the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca, in Medina, and said, I now became Muslim, I'm going back to my people, and I'm going to invite them to Islam.